It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, just the four of us, away from everything. John, Sarah, Mark, and I had been talking about this trip for months, and now it was finally happening. A remote forest, far from any city, with no cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. We were all looking forward to hiking, setting up camp, and of course, sharing stories by the fire at night. The drive to the forest felt long, but as soon as we turned off the main road and started down the dirt path, excitement filled the car. The trees grew thicker the deeper we went, their leaves creating a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were entering another world, cut off from everything we knew. I could feel the tension of everyday life starting to melt away. When we finally arrived at the clearing where we'd set up camp, it was exactly what we imagined. The air was fresh, the silence was peaceful, and the view was incredible. We could hear birds singing, and the wind rustling through the trees was the only background noise. It was just us and the forest. We unloaded the car, grabbed our gear, and started setting up the tents. Sarah and I worked on getting the fire pit ready while John and Mark set up the tents a few feet away, closer to the tree line. The afternoon sun was warm, but we knew it would get cold quickly once night fell. "This is perfect," Sarah said, smiling as she took a deep breath. I couldn't help but agree. It was exactly the break we all needed. Once everything was set up, we decided to explore the area a bit before it got dark. The trail nearby led deeper into the forest, and as we walked, we marveled at how untouched everything felt. It was hard to believe places like this still existed, completely isolated, with no sign of other people for miles. After our hike, we headed back to camp, eager to start the fire and settle in for the evening. The plan was simple: cook dinner, tell stories, and just enjoy each other's company under the stars. We had no idea what the night would bring. By the time we got back to camp, the sun had already started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature was dropping, and a light chill settled into the air, but the fire Mark and John had started was roaring, giving off enough heat to keep us warm. We all grabbed our chairs and gathered around the flames, the soft crackling of the wood mixing with the quiet hum of the forest around us. Dinner was simple, just some hot dogs and marshmallows we roasted over the fire. It felt like the perfect way to kick off the night, with everyone relaxed and in high spirits. We joked around, laughing about things from back home, but it didn't take long before the conversation shifted to something a little more fitting for the setting. "All right," John said, leaning forward with a grin, "who's got a good ghost story?" We all exchanged glances, laughing nervously. It was classic camping tradition, tell ghost stories by the fire. But there was something about being out here, far away from everything, that made the idea a little unsettling. Still, no one wanted to be the first to admit they were spooked. Mark was the first to break the silence, launching into a story about an old abandoned house he swore he once saw as a kid. The details were vague, but his delivery was good, just enough to make us all glance over our shoulders at the dark forest beyond the reach of the firelight. We laughed it off, but I could feel a slight shift in the atmosphere, like the shadows around us were creeping in just a little closer. Sarah followed up with a story she had heard from her grandmother about strange sounds in the woods at night. She talked about eerie footsteps that seemed to follow you, just far enough away that you couldn't see who or what was making them. By the time she finished, we were all a little quieter, and the woods seemed just a little darker. I could tell everyone was starting to feel it. The peaceful calm of the day had shifted into something else entirely. It was still fun, but there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us could quite shake. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt vast and unknown, like anything could be hiding just beyond the tree line. As the fire crackled and sent sparks up into the night sky, we continued talking, but the mood had definitely changed. We were all sitting a little closer to the fire, our voices quieter, eyes occasionally darting out into the darkness. It was the kind of night where you couldn't help but feel like you were being watched, even though you knew there was nothing out there. At least, that's what we kept telling ourselves. Eventually, John stood up, stretching with a yawn. "All right, I'm gonna grab more firewood," he said, glancing over at the pile by the tents. "Anyone coming with me?" No one volunteered. We all laughed nervously, making excuses about being comfortable by the fire. John shrugged and headed off alone, disappearing into the shadows. It should have been fine. But as soon as he was out of sight, the unease settled in even deeper, and we all sat there in silence, listening to the crackling fire and the distant rustle of leaves. That's when we heard it, the faintest sound of something moving in the forest. But it wasn't John. It came from the opposite direction. The fire crackled steadily, but the light it gave off seemed to grow smaller, shrinking into the night. We sat quietly, just listening to the woods around us. At first, it was peaceful, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, something changed. It started out subtle. I heard a soft rustling, like something moving in the underbrush not too far away. I glanced over at Emily, who was staring into the fire, her face lit up by the warm glow. I could tell by the way she was fidgeting that she heard it too. "Probably just a deer," John said, noticing the way we were all a little on edge. He chuckled, trying to brush it off. "We're in the middle of the woods, after all." I nodded, but something about it didn't feel right. The sound wasn't steady, like an animal moving through the trees. It was more erratic, closer, then farther away, then close again. It was hard to place, like it was coming from all around us. Mark threw another log on the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. "Yeah, nothing to worry about. These woods are full of wildlife," he said, his tone light. But even he glanced over his shoulder as he spoke. That's when we heard it, the snapping of branches. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to grab everyone's attention. The kind of sound that could be made by something, or someone, moving through the trees. We all froze, our heads turning toward the direction it had come from, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. "Okay, that was a little weird," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," John said again, but this time, even he didn't sound so sure. Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't know. It sounds too big to be a raccoon," she murmured. We all fell silent, listening carefully. The sound stopped for a moment, leaving us in an eerie stillness. Then, out of nowhere, came something we couldn't ignore: whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. The sound was low and soft, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. It was impossible to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. We all nodded, eyes wide, straining to hear where it was coming from. The whispers seemed to be moving, circling us, like they were playing some kind of game. First from the left, then behind us, then from deep in the trees ahead. No matter how hard we tried to pinpoint them, the voices stayed just out of reach. "It's gotta be the wind," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. He looked around nervously, his eyes darting between the trees. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still unintelligible. It was like they were all around us, coming from every direction at once. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized we weren't alone out here, not in the way we thought. Emily stood up suddenly, pacing a few steps toward the woods, her face pale. "This doesn't feel right," she said, her voice shaking. "I think we should go." John looked at her, then at the rest of us. "Look, it's probably just the wind messing with us, or maybe some people camping nearby," he said, but I could tell he was just trying to keep things calm. None of us really believed it. The forest, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. The trees seemed to close in on us, the darkness pressing against the circle of light from our fire. And the whispers, they didn't stop. The fire was still crackling, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. The whispers had gotten louder, swirling around us like they were carried on the wind, but they weren't. This was something else. Something unnatural. Mark grabbed the flashlight from his bag and stood up. "I'm gonna take a look," he said, his voice shaky but trying to sound brave. He aimed the beam toward the trees, sweeping it slowly from side to side. The light cut through the darkness, but all we saw were the trees, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. No movement. No people. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching us. "There's nothing," Mark muttered, but his voice lacked confidence. He kept the flashlight trained on the woods, as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. The whispers continued, growing more distinct, yet we still couldn't understand a word. It was like they were taunting us, just close enough to hear but not clear enough to comprehend. Emily was pacing, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't like this. We need to get in the tent, lock everything up, and just wait until morning," she said, glancing nervously between the rest of us. "I'm with her," Sarah chimed in, standing up and pulling her jacket tighter around her. She looked pale, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a growing sense of fear. "We should go in the tent, at least we'll feel safer in there." John was the only one still sitting, his eyes fixed on the fire, but I could tell he was just as freaked out as the rest of us. "All right, fine," he finally said, standing up. "Let's get some sleep. Whatever it is, it'll stop in the morning." We started moving toward the tent, trying to keep calm, but just as I reached for the zipper, I froze. A new sound cut through the whispers. Heavy footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from behind the trees. I turned to look at the others, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, not wanting to speak too loudly. Everyone nodded, their faces mirroring my own fear. Mark, still holding the flashlight, quickly spun it toward the sound. The beam swept across the tree line, but again, there was nothing. Yet the footsteps continued, closer now, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. "We need to go," Emily said, her voice barely audible, but laced with panic. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Just that oppressive quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. John finally broke the silence. "Everyone into the tent now," he said, his voice low and urgent. But just as we took a step toward it, the footsteps started again, this time faster, heading straight for us. Just as we were about to rush into the tent, the shadows broke through the tree-line. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as I stared at the figures emerging from the darkness. They looked human at first glance, but something was off, very off. Their movements were jerky, almost unnatural, as if they were puppets being controlled by a careless hand. The air around us thickened with an unsettling energy. We stood frozen, our minds racing but our bodies refusing to move. The figures glided silently around our campsite, whispering in tones that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. It was a disturbing mix of hisses and breathy murmurs that made my skin crawl. The forest seemed to fade away, leaving only us and these strange entities that surrounded us. "Mark, turn off the light," I hissed, barely able to voice the command. But it felt like the flashlight was drawing them closer. He hesitated for a moment, but then he switched it off. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced around us, but now the figures stood out more vividly against the dark. One of them stepped forward, breaking away from the others. It moved closer to the firelight, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The figure had no defined features, its face was obscured, but as it neared, the firelight caught something in its eyes. Those eyes. They glowed. Not in a way that reflected light, but with an eerie luminescence that felt like it was reaching into my soul. They weren't human eyes, they were too wide, too deep, almost like dark voids filled with a strange, unearthly light. I couldn't look away, my body paralyzed with fear. The whispering grew louder, surrounding us like a wave, and I could see the others staring at the figure, their faces pale with terror. The atmosphere felt charged, like a storm was brewing, but all we could do was stand there, trapped in a nightmare. "Run!" John finally shouted, breaking the spell. The word snapped me out of my daze. We didn't need to say anything else. We all turned and sprinted toward the tent, the figures closing in behind us, their whispers rising into a deafening crescendo. As I scrambled for the zipper, my hands trembling, I could feel the oppressive energy pressing against me, like the figures were inches away. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear their movements, the rustling of leaves, and the echo of their voices swirling in the night air. Finally, I yanked the tent open and dove inside, followed closely by the others. We zipped it shut, hearts pounding in unison. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I pressed my ear against the fabric, straining to hear anything from the outside world. But all I could hear was the rapid beating of our hearts and the soft whispers that still seemed to linger, just beyond the thin walls of our shelter. Panic surged through the tent like a wildfire. John's voice cut through the tension as he shouted, "Grab your stuff. We need to get back to the car now." Adrenaline coursed through me as I fumbled with the tent zipper, my hands shaking. We needed to get out of there, away from whatever those figures were. As soon as we burst out into the darkness, the cool night air hit us like a wall. We took off running through the forest, but the pitch blackness enveloped us, making it impossible to see. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle of leaves seemed to mock us as we dashed deeper into the woods. The whispers followed us, an eerie chorus that twisted in my ears, making it hard to think. "Where do we go?" Sarah gasped, glancing around frantically. "I can't see anything." "Just keep moving," Mark urged, trying to keep us focused, but I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on us. It wasn't just dark, It was suffocating. Suddenly, I heard a cry behind me. I turned just in time to see Sarah stumble, her foot catching on an exposed root. She fell hard, and I heard the sickening thud as her ankle twisted beneath her. "Ah, it hurts," she shouted, her voice laced with pain. "Sarah." I called out, feeling a surge of panic. "Can you walk?" "I don't know," she gasped, trying to push herself up but failing. The urgency of our situation crashed over me. We had to keep moving, but leaving her behind was not an option. The shadows were getting closer, darting between the trees like dark smoke, and I could hear the whispers growing louder. "Help her," John shouted. "We can't stop, but we can't leave her." Mark and I quickly rushed back to Sarah's side. I knelt down next to her, my heart racing as I assessed the damage. Her ankle was swelling, a horrible bruise already forming. "We have to support you," I said, glancing over my shoulder nervously. "We can't stay here." With a grunt, I pulled her arm over my shoulder while Mark took her other side. Together, we lifted her up, but our pace was painfully slow. I could feel the fear radiating from her, mingling with my own. The forest felt alive now, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. "We need to hurry," I urged, glancing back. The shadowy figures were moving closer, their forms shifting in and out of the darkness. They seemed to be closing in around us, whispering louder, as if they were encouraging us to give up. Every step we took felt like a race against time. I pushed aside the branches that clawed at my arms and tried to ignore the suffocating sensation of being watched. "Keep going. We can make it," I shouted, trying to muster strength that I wasn't sure I had left. Just as we broke through a cluster of trees, I caught a glimpse of something glinting in the distance. Our car. "There!" I yelled, feeling a surge of hope. But just as we picked up our pace, I heard the whispers transform into something more sinister, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was as if the very forest itself was alive, and it wanted us to stay. "Run!" John yelled again, and we pushed ourselves harder, desperation fueling our every movement. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to escape this night unscathed. We sprinted through the darkness, adrenaline pushing us forward until we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station hidden deep in the woods. The structure was weathered and covered in creeping vines, but it was our only hope. "In here," I shouted, throwing the door open and ushering the others inside. We piled in and quickly shut the door behind us, slamming it closed with a heavy thud. My heart raced as we caught our breath, leaning against the walls as we tried to gather our thoughts. But my eyes widened in horror as I took in our surroundings. Strange symbols were etched into the wooden walls, their meanings lost to time but radiating an unsettling energy. Claw marks ran jaggedly across the surface, as if something had tried to break in before. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They can't get in, right?" Mark said, attempting to reassure us as he looked around. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, mirroring my own fears. The oppressive silence was soon broken by the whispers outside. The shadowy figures were surrounding the station, their voices rising to a frantic pitch, echoing through the woods. It was as if they were communicating, chanting something in a language I couldn't understand. My skin crawled, and I pressed my back against the wall, desperate to make myself as small as possible. "We can't stay here," John said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to decide what to do next." "What are our options?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. The thought of running back into the darkness was terrifying, yet staying felt just as dangerous. "We could try to fight," Mark suggested, looking around for anything we could use as a weapon. "But what if we're outnumbered?" "Or we could risk it and run deeper into the forest," Sarah offered, her eyes wide with fear. "But what if we get even more lost?" The whispers outside grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever those things were, they were drawing closer. I could almost feel their presence pressing against the walls of the station, eager to get in. "We have to make a choice," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Stay here and face whatever is coming, or take our chances in the woods. Either way, we might not make it out." Mark looked between us, his face pale. "What if we split up? One group stays here to defend, while the other tries to find a way out." "No," John shot back, shaking his head vehemently. "We can't split up. We need to stick together. There's strength in numbers." The whispers transformed into an almost deafening roar, and the door shook as something pounded against it from the outside. My heart raced as dread filled the air. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice firm despite the fear coursing through me. "We need to make a run for it now." With no time to waste, we gathered our courage and braced ourselves for whatever awaited us outside. The fear of the unknown felt heavy in the air, but staying put was no longer an option. We had to escape this nightmare, even if we didn't know where we would end up. Together, we flung the door open and stepped into the shadows, ready to face whatever was lurking in the forest.